panel. And this one we designed to wrap up the content. This is very important to us. We feel this is a critical part of the missing link in creating a resilient ecosystem. We're bringing together 4 experts in policy to look at how the role of governments can play in supporting this ecosystem. First, we have Viljar Lubi, Ambassador of Estonia to the UK, Rob Murray of Saab, and Sir Matthew Rycroft, Permanent Undersecretary of State at the Home Office. And moderating this panel is Catherine Day from the Cabinet Office of the UK Government. Give them a round of applause.
It's wonderful to see a room that still has people in it. Thank you for still being with us. We have the completely impossible task in the next 25 minutes of doing justice to 2 days of absolutely brilliant conversation. The good news is, though, that I couldn't have a better panel to do this with. So over the last couple of days, and we're going to try and sort of riff on some of these themes and bring out some of the big sort of what next type steps. So over the last couple of days, we have heard how immense and important the challenges are that we face. We've heard this from the guy in charge of our army. We've heard how this is existential for our societies. We've heard how complex and dynamic the context is. So we need the best brains on the case. And I think, over this conference, there's been a real buzz and excitement around that mission, which is great. A friend of mine always says, government has the best problems. And we've started to talk about, okay, well, how do we share all of these then and bring you into this space? I think that there are 2 other really important things for me that the last couple of days have done. The first is that it has started to unite us around this common mission. And I always think that government is quite often misconstrued. It's easy to think about it as something other, whereas I see it as really being the sum total of the choices that we collectively make about how we'll organize ourselves. And the second thing it's really brought home for me is how innovation and the startup sector and the tech sector and this sort of thriving world of venture capital are a source of national power. So innovation is a source of national power and how we get strategic advantage. And our task, as I see it, is to really tap into that and unlock it. So 3 big themes for us to look at coming out of all of this. The first around our policy and our institutions and the extent to which they're really fit to do this unlocking for us. Viljar, I might come to you first on this because you've lived this and breathed it in Estonia. Estonia is one of these countries that's often cited as sort of poster child for innovation. And you have been involved in initiatives that have literally set out to break the system in order to make it better. Talk to us a bit about Estonia and Accelerate Estonia and what we should learn from that.
I think that all those questions are very, very difficult to answer in a very short period of time. I think all countries, all bureaucracies, in a way, are similar. Public sectors are similar. There are a couple of elements that characterize our systems. First, all public sectors focus too much on writing strategies, and they don't focus enough on implementing them. Secondly, we can start new policies, but they don't end the old ones. Thirdly, in public sector, everything is equally important. Fourthly, we try to do everything at once. I think this is, the challenge that we're facing in public sector. And another thing that is very different in public sector and private sector is that public sector always sees challenges. Private sector always sees opportunities. I think also the mental element is different. So the thing is that how do you do innovation? The thing is that, especially if you take national defense or health sector, then the obvious thing is that you cannot risk those kinds of things. And if you talk about innovation by default means a risk is involved. So that it doesn't mean that everything we do in national defense have to be innovative. Then probably we don't have credible national defense. Resilience the same. But what we try to do in Estonia is that, okay, put aside that people like you deal with the mainstream policies on a daily basis, and you don't always have the time to do sexy, innovative stuff. Then the thing is, as Accelerate Estonia, you mentioned how we try to do it. That when I was in my previous job, I was a business secretary for Estonia, and I think I'm also, this kind of open-minded guy. Lots of good ideas came to me, said, yes, there, let's do it, and I will help you. When we met again 4 months later, what had happened in between? Nothing. Because my daily affair, my political bosses tell me what I need to do. So that's why I thought, okay, the problem is that political attention is so split and so short-term that let's filter it down, that let's do some things that are sexy, but let's deliver them as well. Let's do a few things, but let's actually implement them. So my long still introduction probably is that in public sector, public services, I would say that it's like take a stock market. That I think governments by default need to be conservative. 90% you invest in bonds. And then you take this 5% that you invest in stocks knowing that it can fail. But you cannot put more than that, I think, in public sector, than 5–10%.
And so how is it going, before I let you sort of finish on that?
We have, as I said, innovation involves risks. So we have our failures, we have our successes. So that the most important thing is that you need to focus and you need to deliver, because it's a race with time and you race with you compete with everybody else. What we try to do in defense, we try to do in economy and so on, it doesn't mean that, we only do it in Estonia or you do it here in the UK. Everybody does that. The only question is who does it the fastest. The thing is also that, what the General said yesterday as well, that in even national defense, things can change in days, if not in weeks, well, weeks for sure. So that means that, this kind of how quickly can you do things is important. And, maybe one thing that is advantage of being a small country, because one thing, again, that is very, very crucial, when we discuss something, we say, let's do it. Then, I usually in Estonia don't have a luxury that somebody's sitting behind my back, taking notes and deliver. No, it has to be me. In a bigger bureaucracy, you always think that there is somebody in the room who takes notes and does something about it. And that's a very big thing, a very big problem, and I think it's the same in private sector. So it's not only a public sector issue.
So you've teed up Rob next to you really well. You've talked about how things can be easier on a smaller national scale. Rob, you've done this times 32 in NATO. So you've sort of made it a personal mission to try to shift NATO into this space. How has that gone? And I'm keen to sort of get into this business of, as the General was sort of talking about yesterday, of what makes us good mission partners. We've heard this loud call over the last couple of days for mission partnerships. And what's the sort of adaptation that we need to introduce to be good national and international mission partners?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. And I should say, whilst it says, and I do indeed work for Saab, I was at NATO for 10 years or so, and Saab no longer make cars, in case anyone thinks they do. But the challenge, I think, when it comes to policy is that policy is about making choices. Right? Fundamentally, it is about having to make choices. And that becomes really difficult because what comes with that is accountability and responsibility. So good policy, in my opinion, should be super ambitious and actually incredibly risk-embracing. And the reason I say that is because the nation state, or states, and I'll come on to the specifics of NATO in a second, they can do things which no other entity can do. Risk is measurable, and lots of companies will seek to measure risk and have blah, blah. Well, nation states can go beyond that. They can go into the world of uncertainty. And quite, they should, and that's why we've got some of those amazing technologies today, because of the era of the Cold War and all of the technologies that span out of that, from touchscreen to GPS to speech recognition, so on and so forth. It all came from governments. Right? It didn't come from anybody else. So my point being is, it's not a competition. That's not what I'm trying to sort of suggest or highlight. But I think there's a real mindset about when we think about policy in nation states that often we don't show in the public sector enough ambition. And yet we have the tools to be wildly ambitious. And so when we think about, or when I think about NATO, I mean, that is quite a unique organization, and you're having to deal with, as you rightly say, Catherine, 32 countries. And the challenge there when it comes to policy is you've got to find that middle ground. You've got to find the consensus. And there is a middle ground. There is always one. You just have to find it. But we have to recognize that in our business of national security and defense, the currency we trade in is trust. That is the currency. And I would urge that if there's one thing that people remember from my ramblings over the next few minutes, it is that sentence. We trade in trust. So if you are a startup, if you are a venture capitalist, if you are within government or wherever you sit within that ecosystem that Fiona described earlier, it is about trust. And really your job is not to show a shiny product or a shiny initiative. Your job is to, how does X, Y, Z enhance trust? Because when we are talking national security of nation states, of these leviathans, and at a multinational level, that is all that matters. So when there is frustration that things are slow and perhaps things don't work as one would wish, it is because there's a trust deficit. And so this is about trust. So bringing it back to Brussels and my time there when I created the NATO Innovation Fund and Diana, it was trying to build confidence in nations that actually we want to make sure that our soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen and airwomen are able to have the latest technology, have the very best as quickly as possible. And the methodologies that we have at the moment didn't necessarily achieve that. So we needed some new tools in the toolbox, and it would enhance our ability to work together as that wider community. So when one starts to frame it in the language which ambassadors and deputy ambassadors and people who had to wander around the building to try and convince on this understand, then actually it becomes a lot easier and clearer to recognize that, okay, this is a good thing to do. There is, I mean, what I wouldn't recommend is what I did on one of my first meetings, where I said, yeah, we're looking to raise €1 billion venture capital fund, and actually, I can't tell you if anything's going to work, and it's going to go wildly into the world of uncertainty, but some stuff should be cool. The vibe in the room there with the ambassadors, in I think it was a Danish delegation of sort of 15 or so countries, that was a learning experience in so much as, all right, we need to, recalibrate slightly.
What won them over?
Essentially, I think a combination of persistence, and actually, in this case, it was Emmanuel Macron, because when he gave his 2019 Economist interview and described NATO as strategically brain dead, that created a policy reaction inside the building, which resulted in something called NATO 2030, which was then announced at the London summit a month or so later. Now, there wasn't really anything to go under that umbrella of NATO 2030, but because I'd been working on Diana and the NATO Innovation Fund, that I was able to hook that into that policy, and away it went. So the point being was, just like product market fit is important for startups and for venture capitalists, it's the same in the policy world. You have to make sure that the political timing is right in order to try and get things through.
Some interesting themes coming out of this around trust and mindset, and I'm struck that they're quite cultural. And I'm struck that the thing that for you made the difference there, was the political leadership. That's sort of very, very clear. So I'm looking forward to the conference next year, including an ever sort of broadening audience for that. Look, I'd like to dig slightly into this sort of question of pace and how to do that at pace. And we've seen the pace that Ukraine has forced. And I'm fascinated by the fact that in 6 years they've moved up 97 places in the, I think it's sort of public service delivery index, all sort of prompted by war. But do we need that to build these sorts of capabilities? Can we make ourselves sort of readier for these crises? Matthew, you've lived through many of these. are living through many of these at the Home Office now. What are your thoughts?
Great question. Thank you, Catherine, and great to see everyone here. So I think there's sort of good news and bad news on this one. I guess the bad news is that the public sector in the UK, perhaps particularly embodied by the Home Office, does not have a reputation always for being the paciest or the most innovative or the most radical. And too many of our measures are sort of input measures rather than outcomes. The good news, though, is that I think that we are totally up for a change. We have to come together across the public sector and the private sector to tackle these sorts of issues. That's why they're so exciting. And the new British government, as you know, has got this mission-based approach to thinking about, the 5 really big things that need to be done in our country. And none of them can be done just by one bit of government. You've got to break out of those silos, and you've got to act fast. The other bit of good news, the Home Office loves a good crisis. It brings out the best in people. And one of the things I've been trying to do in the time I've been leading it is to change that culture so that we get the benefits of that crisis working, but without having to have the crisis. And PACE is actually is a good example of that. We moved 1,000 people off the Rwanda scheme and onto something else over a weekend. That's, I think most organizations would be pretty pleased to have been able to do that in the private sector, as well as in the public sector. That is a pacey thing to do, and it wasn't a crisis. We planned it, and we did it. And I would love to get the sort of sense of everyone in this room coming together to help that sort of pace and to put it onto the biggest problems that our society faces.
I'm quite interested by, one of the things that struck me about the conversation yesterday was the sense of there potentially being a trade-off between collaboration and paciness. The sense that collaboration, if you're sort of looking at trust building and so on, can take a long time. And then Shashank Joshi used the word gung-ho, and a friend of mine showed me the etymology of that. And I was really struck by this because it comes from 2 Chinese words, the word for work and the word for together. And there was a sense of sort of penny dropping that actually get the collaboration working well, and you can do things massively quickly with a great sort of spirit of urgency, as I think we're seeing in Ukraine.
I think anyone who thinks haven't got time for collaboration is absolutely on the wrong track. Ditto, you haven't got time for personal development, you're on the wrong track. If you feel as though you haven't got time, you need to do some personal development, to do stuff differently. And if you think you haven't got time for collaboration, you need to be doing even more collaboration. So collaboration is something which speeds things up, even if you do absolutely, as Rob and others said, require the investment to get the trust in the first place.
And so Rolly Walker was talking yesterday about wanting to start building the big tent with the people in this room, in which we could all sort of come together in pursuit of these common missions. I'm wondering what that big tent looks like. Who's in it? Who owns it? How do we align all of the things that need to be aligned? I'm interested in your reflections, Matthew, from a cross-government perspective, these different missions, these different strategies that keep coming out of government. What are the ones that we collectively need to be engaging with, aligning? I'm interested in the cross-sectoral and the international dimensions of this as well. But maybe we stick with you, Matthew,
I mean, very briefly, the tent has got to be as big as it possibly can be, provided everyone in the tent knows what their job is, and they know and that each person, or at least as many people as possible, are playing to their strengths. It's no good, there's no point in the public sector doing a pale version of the private sector. The public sector needs to do what only the public sector can do. As Hannah and Ilana were talking about 2 panels ago, that includes setting the overall direction. It also includes a huge amount of funding. It also includes taking on risk that aspects of the private sector would not be prepared to take. There are just 3, I would say, advantages of the public sector. There are all sorts of things which the public sector should not just leave to the private sector, but should be actively giving space to, actively engaging the private sector to co-create.
Maybe I can just build on that. So when I think about that question, Catherine, and building on what Matthew's saying, I completely agree. There are some things the public sector are great at. There's some things it's terrible at. So let's stick to what we're good at. Who else should be involved? Who else should be in that tent? Well, universities, corporations, entrepreneurs, risk capital, and you know, companies of all sizes. I think the challenge, though, when you have that sort of environment is that you have to make sure that there is a mechanism, it's clear what one is trying to achieve, you know, and I think that mission focus, I'm struck, I think Fiona mentioned it earlier, talked about COVID and COVID task force. I'm struck by the work Kate Bingham did in sort of supporting that. But equally, on the government side, if there's going to be government money there's got to be contracts. There has to be, right? People are not, if you're not in the public sector, it means you have to earn a wage somehow. And so if you're going to give your time, that has to be paid for. And so I think that it's perhaps, no, in fact, no, I don't think it's tactical, actually. I think this is one of the biggest challenges, and it's actually a theme that has come up throughout, that if we're going to create that sort of environment, then we have to overcome the incredible difficulty of getting contracts through government and into the hands of those entities, because it kind of doesn't matter how much money you have. Right? If you can have all the money in the world and it could kind of drop into government tomorrow, you can't get it out the door. You don't have the ability to, and so one doesn't have the ability to. And it's not a problem unique to the United Kingdom. It was a problem when I was in Brussels. It was a problem unique to the Alliance. So 32 countries all have this problem, but it doesn't feel intractable. And it needs to be overcome for this to work. We have to, solve this. But there's political risk when we talk about money and contracts, and we're seeing it in this country now with the potential review of the COVID contracts and so forth. So this is not a simple fix. And so on the one hand, yes, you have a great example of how the private and public sector came together through that COVID crisis, but now the way in which it was managed, perhaps commercially, is going to be looked at, I suspect, quite in depth. And that's an issue. So we've got to try and find a way of working that doesn't result in a sort of political football being kicked about.
Yeah, I was struck by what Paul Kwan was talking about yesterday, and his very strong message: don't worry about the capital. The capital's there. Sort out the contracting, and that's what will unlock the radical collaboration. Is that your experience, Viljar?
I totally agree with what has been said before, and I think, for me, everything I was hearing today and yesterday, it was all about its success only can come through collaboration. Totally agree. And what Matthew said as well, that we literally need to be all in one big room, but it's only one part of the solution. I think one thing that is really missing, and we constantly need to work on it, we also need to listen. I think this is like just, being in the room and talking to each other is not enough. And what I mean by that sometimes I think we assume too much, both sides, and assume that the other side understands us without saying some elements around it. I give you one example. Being Estonian, during my dinner parties with business people, I always say that Estonia has 11 unicorns. And only later discovered that not everybody knows what unicorn means. So that I assume that everybody does, but people don't. So that we assume that everybody understands. And for example, that takes Diana, that you launched. The thing is that this is for civilian use cases that might have also output in the military. Now the question is, do you think that civilians really understand what military wants? The thing is, do they listen, and do they have, this opportunity? What I mean by also listening is that I think the key thing in collaboration between the private and public sector is to say things very simply. You mentioned that I very briefly spoke about Accelerate Estonia. Accelerate Estonia, the value proposition is that if you have a private sector idea that there is a potential market, but it's either over-regulated or under-regulated, so government needs to intervene before it gets to the market, then during the accelerated process, in a way it's very similar to what Diana does, but we have this government element there. The only thing that we do is to help those ideas to make their message so simple that it fits into 4 slides. Because we give you the 20 minutes in the Estonian government, you can pitch to yourself, the Prime Minister, ministers, but on 4 slides. The point being, ministers' attention span is limited because they have so many things to do. Unless you can say things shortly and simply, nothing will succeed. I think both sides, the private sector needs to understand that please make a thing you really ask, very, very simple. Ministers don't have the time to read your booklets that are 20 pages long, never ever.
I love that, Viljar. And you have teed us up very, very well for our last minute of this ridiculously short panel by talking about the need to listen to each other, not make assumptions, to understand each other better. I'm going to hold you to the challenge of doing something really succinct and short, because we've heard a lot about how the one thing that institutions and governments can do is create the tent and then set the direction. So 10 seconds each. What is the direction that you want to set for us collectively to do next? Give yourself a time scale if you like. So by this time next year, when we get back together again, give us our mission. Go. Rob, you look as though you're ready to speak first.
Sure. So for me, the biggest thing I'd like to see happen is this community, the national security defense community, leveraging capital markets, properly leveraging capital markets. The scale of investment necessary is just way too big. Venture capital is part of it, but it's a drop in the ocean for what's needed. Capital markets, properly integrated, using market power, and what are we in now, 24? Yeah, I think by the end of next year, there's no reason why we couldn't be doing that.
And this is the man with the plan. Come on, we're out of time, but I still want to hear, Viljar, your mission, and Matthew, yours.
For me, probably the thing is that, as you know, you have heard the term 5 whys. You have to ask 5 times why you do something. So that if we talk about, this conference is about the resilience, that both sides, that companies zoom out to understand the things that they don't only do to earn money, but maybe they understand they also build the resilience of the country they're living in. And also from the public sector side, we understand we don't do the thing for the do just to earn our salary, but to do it something for the greater good. So zoom out, ask why many times.
So that public service mission Aaron was talking about yesterday. Matthew.
Whether you're an individual or a country or a company or the whole globe, resilience for me equals prevention plus agility. So preventing bad stuff happening and having the agility to react to whatever the world throws at us.
So it's possible we've just proven that actually institutions aren't brilliant at setting direction. I'll leave you to judge that. If you can collectively do better, let's do that. Let's co-create our mission. Look, we are the last panel. Thank you so much for your reflections. Next time I hope we'll have a lot longer. And on behalf of all of us, as we are the last panel, I'd like to really thank the organisers and everybody behind the scenes here, because I think that what you and what we collectively have started, I mean, if we all take nothing else home from this, I hope it will be that this is the start of something really great, of building that tent, of building that shared mission, and of achieving that radical collaboration that will create a safer world. Couldn't have a more important mission. Thank you. Thank you.